what you said you were gonna do. So if you're a buyer's agent, the best way to terminate agency is to find them a house, and they buy the house and they moved in. And the agency is then terminated. If you're selling a house, the best way to end agency is to do what you said you were gonna do. You're gonna find them a ready, willing, and able buyer, and they buy the house, and the sellers can go off to do whatever they were planning to do. So completing or fulfilling the purpose is certainly the number one way that we can terminate agency. Could the listing agent get paid without the house being sold? Might they get paid? How could that happen?
If they bring the person ready to buy and the seller's back out of it.
Oh. So the listing agent brings a ready, willing, and able buyer for the price that was acceptable to the seller, and then the seller decides not to sell the house. So legally, the listing firm can go to that seller and say, hey, we did what we said we were gonna do. You owe us the commission. Right? Practically speaking, that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes you just don't get paid. But what you have to make sure that you've had that conversation with the seller ahead of time, that if they're feeling any hesitancy about selling their house, they need to work that out ahead of time. Because remember that acting in good faith, right? If they've said they want to sell their house and they're acting in good faith to sell it, then there shouldn't be a problem with them selling it once we've found a ready, willing, and able buyer. So it's critical that they follow through with that. And if they don't, they might actually get sued by the buyer, right? So it's a good idea for them to have all that worked out ahead of time. The next way that we can terminate agency is when the agency expires. It automatically just drops out. We can't just put, I'll list it to it till it sells. But we could say something like December 1st, 2099, right? If my seller wanted to sell a $100,000 house for $1 million, we might need a listing till 2099, right? But you have to have a date in there, and it automatically expires on that date. So I tell people that I'm listing your house and it's a 6-month listing, but it's really more like a 2-month or a 2-week listing. Because if at some point while we're listed, you say, you know, I want to fire you, Wayne. I've never been fired, but I wouldn't want somebody to feel like they were stuck with me and they just go around town saying, I'm stuck with this Wayne Young guy, I can't get rid of him. Gotta wait another 3 months to, before I can get another realtor. So we could mutually agree to terminate the agency, right, if it just wasn't working out. And I tell people, if there's ever any complaint or problem, talk to me about it, because we're working together to get this house sold, and if there's something I can fix, I'll be glad to do that. So let's just talk about it. But if we really can't decide, I would ask that you give me some time, a couple of weeks to fix whatever the problem was that you're concerned about. And if we haven't done that, then we would release you from that contract. Because it doesn't do us any good to make somebody stay under contract. Can a seller terminate the contract on their own? Can they say bye-bye to their listing agency? The answer is no. Nor can the firm say bye-bye to a seller or a buyer unilaterally, because it's a bilateral agreement. They have to mutually agree to terminate the contract. What is that?
Strange.
Oh. Okay. So mutual agreement can do it, or if one of the parties breaches the agreement. court will say it's okay that you left that seller in the dust because they'd already breached your agreement. By operation of law, what this is talking about is when the courts say, you can no longer sell this house. So bankruptcy or a foreclosure or something like that, there's nothing that you can do about that. So the last one would be destruction or condemnation of the property. I know this was next to the last one. If the house burns down and you can't sell it, then you don't have a listing anymore. Does the fact that the house burned down, let's say there was under contract and the house has a fire, does that mean that the buyer and seller no longer have a contract? No. Because as you'll see when you go through the contract thoroughly, there's actually a clause about that. And so the buyer has choices. Let's say that the seller can collect insurance. It might be that he goes ahead and sells the house to the buyer and the buyer gets the insurance. And so that's a decision that the buyer has to make depending on the situation. I did sell a house that had a fire one time. My seller client called me up, and this was a client that I had helped him buy and sell numerous houses. He was an investor, and he had this little 3-bedroom bungalow, and he said, well, when they had a fire, an electrical fire, and basically everything from the ceiling of the first floor up to the roof burned. And so I've collected the insurance payment, but I'm just wondering if I can sell it as is. And I was like, well, I don't see any reason why not. He said, well, how much do you think it's worth? Now, this was a little house, little bitty house. I said, I have no idea about it. How about $9,000? He said, okay. So we listed the house for $9,000. That was the lowest amount I ever listed a house for. And I got $11,000 for the house. And the best part about it, the house was bought by these 2 Italian guys that came down from New Jersey somewhere and decided to buy up houses and fix them up. And the best part about it was my wife and I were volunteers at a homeless shelter in Greensboro. And one morning, we had spent the night at the shelter and we were having breakfast with the guests, and one of our guests came in. He said, Wayne, I got a job. I said, really? Yeah. He said, yeah, these 2 Italian guys bought this burned out house and they've hired me to help them fix it up. I said, that's awesome. I know that house. And so sure enough, they fixed the house all up. I think they sold it again. And so, that was a really happy ending for that. So it's also the most percentage over list price, I think, of any house that I ever sold. So certainly if it's condemned, it'll make it difficult to sell. And the last thing, I promise, is if either party dies. But what does that mean, really? Of course, if you have a seller, an individual selling a house and they die, you don't have a listing anymore. Well, what if it's a couple and you have it listed with the 2 of them and one of them dies? Do you lose the listing then? No. No, because the spouse is going to inherit that property, and now there may be other heirs. There, it may complicate things a little bit. You may have to redo some things, but the listing doesn't completely go away. What about on the other side? Is it possible that the firm could die? Yes. But if I'm the listing agent and I die, do we no longer have a listing?
You still have some.
We still have a listing because I didn't list the house. Alan Tate listed the house, right? And in fact, I tell my sellers, you don't need to worry. If I keel over tomorrow, you listed the house with Alan Tate, they're gonna take care of you. So, I'm not planning on going anywhere, but if something were to happen to me, you would be well cared for by Alan Tate. But the death or incapacitation of either party would terminate the agency. All right. You know, the order that this textbook takes all this stuff is kind of funky. And so I'll just apologize for the publishers of the textbook. I'm trying to stick with it as best I can. So, very quickly, the listing agency, who is the agent? The firm. Who's the principal? Well, in a listing agency, who would the principal be? The seller of the house. What's in the listing agreement? Remember, we gotta have, what's the compensation gonna be? When does it terminate? Has to be signed by everybody. And of course, there's lots of other details in there to try to keep everybody out of trouble. And it must be in writing before any services are rendered. So in a listing agreement, you can't put the sign up in front of the house without that signed listing agreement. So when your client calls you from the beach and says, hey, you know what, I decided to sell my Greensboro house. Can you just go ahead and put the sign up there and start showing it? And when I get back in town next week, we'll do the paperwork. How's that? Nope, sorry. That's what they make DocuSign for, right? Electronic signatures. You can send it to them anywhere. They can do it right on their phone. List their house. Yeah. A buyer agency agreement. In a buyer's agency agreement, who's the agent? The firm. Who's the principal? The buyer or buyers. Does not have to be in writing immediately. So we can have an oral buyer's agency, but it must be in writing prior to presenting an offer. So how long could you have oral buyer's agency? Years. And there are some buyer clients that might take that long, right? But I wouldn't recommend that you wait until you are ready to make an offer to put that in writing. Now, your broker in charge is going to tell you, you know, when you meet a client at the house, before they walk in the house, on the hood of the car, they should be signing that exclusive buyer agency agreement. That's not usually the way it works. Usually, you know, buyer's agency is kind of like dating. You know, you have to have a few dates with each other before they are ready to sign on the dotted line. A listing contract, because it's going to cost you thousands of dollars up front to have that professional photography done and you know, advertise and all of that, you're gonna want that in writing right away. Mainly because that's the law, but also because it's going to protect you. So oral buyer agency, what's important to know about that is that you can't have an exclusive buyer agency agreement with somebody if it's only oral. So what does that mean? They can have 5 different buyer agencies out there looking for a house for them, all under oral buyer agency agreements. Does that sound like an ideal situation for you as the broker? No. But it's true. You cannot be exclusive. You know, sort of like dating when you have, you know, people dating whoever they want. Not always a good situation. And you cannot bind or obligate the buyer. So if they choose to buy a house with another broker, tough luck. So you've lost all that gas money. Does not obligate the buyer to work with any specific broker or firm for any period of time. So you also can't say, well, how about this? How about if you just work with me for the next month? Okay? Now you can do that if it's in writing, but if it's only oral, you cannot specify a time period that they will work exclusively with you. Okay? So if you want exclusivity, or you want to work together for a particular period of time, you gotta have it in writing. And the broker has no protection, no claim for compensation from this client. So you may be totally out of luck. If it wasn't confusing already, here's some more types of agencies, right? And what this refers to really is, how do firms work? How does Allen Tate work? How does Yost and Little, Berkshire Hathaway, Home Services, Real Estate? How do they work? So one of the earliest forms that we had fun with the other night was exclusive seller agency. Essentially, the broker represents only sellers. So Bonnie was the buyer, but she didn't have any agency agreement with Allen Tate, right? The old Allen Tate. You weren't here for our Jan Secor radio theater, but it was really fun, actually.
Sounds
You
exciting.
did a great job. So, the company, the firm that has this kind of thing, they only work with sellers. So this is very rare today, you hardly ever would see that. So they would be able to list your house, but when you sold your house and you wanted to buy a house, you couldn't use that firm, okay? So they're exclusively a seller agency. Same thing on the buyer side, you could have exclusive buyer agency. There are some firms that have tried this, to try to just work with buyers. But as I talked about yesterday, it really is hard to make a living, because you can only haul one family around at a time, but you can have lots of listings. And so you have to list to last. So again, this is very rare. So some firms then went to something called single agency, and this is where the broker represents only one party in a transaction. So they can work with the seller on this transaction, and then when they go to buy a house, they could work with the buyer, them as the same person as a buyer, in another transaction. But they couldn't work with both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. So single agency, they're only working with one party for any one transaction. And then we get to the fun part, dual agency. So Allen Tate has a listing, and they put it out there, and an Allen Tate broker has a buyer that wants to buy that house. Now, Allen Tate is representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time. And so can Allen Tate get both the buyer and the seller the best deal possible? Right? There's an inherent problem with this situation. Remember that as an agent, the firm owes the buyer all of that loyalty, disclosure, all of that, right? And they're supposed to find out anything they can about the other side to try to help them to do better in the deal. But that's also true for the buyer side. They owe all of their duties of loyalty to that buyer as well. So it's nearly impossible to give both parties the same degree of loyalty, right? If you find out something about one or the other, and are giving that information to the other party, you're not being loyal to the first party. So it creates this environment that is kind of uncomfortable, to tell you the truth. So we have this fiduciary duty to both parties. It's really interesting. This is dual agency. is probably the reason why, Total Wine sells a lot of wine to real estate agents. So the question is, how do we do that? So here's the situation. Remember I showed you the other day where I had this wall of separation between the buyer and the seller normally. But when we have a dual agency situation, we have sort of a modified line of separation. So I can help you, but I can't help you as much as I could have if this person was with a different firm. Because we may or may not know something about that other party, and I can't tell you that. So you have a listing firm and a selling firm. So we might have two agents, or it may just be one agent that's working with both the buyer and the seller. In any case, we have one firm, we have one transaction, and we have two principals, the buyer and the seller. That's what makes up dual agency. So you have one firm, one transaction, and two clients. And this modified line of separation makes a big difference, because now if the buyer says, well, how much should I offer? What do you have to tell them? I can't tell you. I can't tell you what you should offer, because my firm is working for the seller. That's not going to make them very happy. What you can do is provide them with the same information that you provided the seller. When you go to the seller, what's the seller going to ask? Well, should I counter that offer? If you're working for the buyer, you say, no, you should accept that offer, right? If you're working just for the seller, you say, of course you should counter that offer. That's way too low. They should pay full price. When it comes to repairs, if you're working exclusively for the buyer, you're going to want a long list of repairs done, right? If you're working for the seller, you're like, well, let them fix it themselves. So you see what this dual agency does is it kind of neutralizes you. So all you can say is, this is your decision. I'll provide you with as much information as I can, but it's up to you to decide. How much are you willing to take? What kind of offer should you make? What kind of repairs should you ask for? It's a very difficult situation. Some of the most uncomfortable situations that I've had in real estate happen with a dual agency situation. I had my next door neighbor's house listed, and I had an open house there, and this lovely couple showed up at the open house, and they asked about the house, and I told them, that I was working for the seller, but that we could work together in a dual agency situation. We sat on the porch during the open house, and I told them all about the wonderful neighborhood and this great next door neighbor they would have. It was me. And they said, well, we'd like to buy the house, and we'd like for you to be our buyer's agent. We like you. We think you're pretty cool. So I said, fine. Now, when I listed the house, I asked for permission to act as a dual agent if that situation arose. So my seller had already agreed, in theory anyway, to act for us to act as a dual agent. And she was fine. I told her we got this buyer and so forth. She was happy that we found a buyer. And but over time, my next door neighbor, as it got closer and closer to closing, got kind of weirder and weirder. She would sneak out at night and clip the bushes because she thought that I would get mad at her because I have the buyer, right? And she wanted to take some of these plants with her to her next house or something. She told somebody that my children were spying on her, to help out the buyer. So it got really strange at the end. But most of the time, these things work out as long as you are acting in good faith to be fair to both parties, and that you are making sure that you're having equal treatment to them. But in general, dual agency means you can't do much for them. So, let's say we have a situation which happens all the time. I have the listing, but another agent in my firm has the buyer. Okay? Why couldn't the firm just say, okay, Wayne, you just work with your seller, and Sam, you just work with your buyer. And we'll just pretend that you're in two different companies and you work exclusively with us. Why not do that? The answer is, you can. What do we call that? We call it designated dual agency. So it's a special case of dual agency, but it is designated dual agency. I think I jumped a little bit. Let's just see here. So before I move on to designated, dual agency has to be in writing. It has to be informed consent. So both the buyer and the seller have to be informed ahead of time. But what if you have oral buyer's agency? Can you get dual agency consent orally? Yes, you can. It can be oral. But before, how do you do that? Well, you just talk about it. My company has this house listed. I just want to let you know ahead of time, which is a dual agency situation if you were decided to purchase this house. Simple as that. But before you wrote up an offer, not only would you have to write up your buyer's agency, but also get the dual agency in writing as well. So let's just quickly kind of look at this real quick. On page 159 in your textbook, shows some different flavors of dual agency. So one would be the situation like I had with my next door neighbor's house. The first one, this is on page 159. So we have Alan Tate, my brokerage firm, and me as the licensee. I had both the seller and the buyer. I can tell you, I've been in business since 2001, and I can count on one hand the number of times that I had both the buyer and the seller. It is a very rare occurrence. Just think about it. I list a house, and there are 1,500 agents in our area. 1,500, and more every day, thanks to you all. And so what are the chances that I'm going to have a buyer that fits this criteria for this house compared to all the other 1,499 agents out there that are working with buyers? Chances are much greater that somebody else is going to bring that buyer. So it's a rare occasion that I would actually have a buyer for my own listing. Now, if I was listing hundreds of homes, maybe that would increase my odds a lot more, but that's not the case.
Do you still show them a lot of your houses that you list, like your buyers?
Oh, sure, if it fits their criteria, yeah, absolutely. And probably the situation that arises more often is what I described just a bit ago. I already have the listing, and somebody calls and says, I'd like to see that house. Now, I don't have a buyer's agency agreement with them yet, but once I meet them, they decide to work with me, and they decide to buy that house. Now, chances are they're not going to like that house. They're going to want something else. And that just happens more often than not. So the first dual agency type would be where one agent is working both the buyer and the seller, but it's fairly rare. More commonly would be the second type, where you have one person working with the seller and one working with the buyer. In a big firm like Allen Tate, that happens a lot, because there's hundreds of agents in our area that work for Allen Tate. Key here, let's say you're working for Keller Williams. Keller Williams, each office is owned independently. And so, an agent from another Keller Williams office wouldn't necessarily be a dual agency situation. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the third type would be where you have different branches of the same firm. Would be the case with Allen Tate, where we have the Green Valley branch and we have the North Elm branch, but those two branches are still considered one firm. All of our branches are considered one firm. And so anybody from either branch selling and buying would be considered dual agency. But it's still one firm, two clients in one transaction together. Make sense? All right. Moving. Just remember, you can't disclose without permission. The willingness to accept any terms of sale other than those offered, the motivation of participating in the transaction, or any confidential information unless disclosure is mandatory by statute. So you have a dual agency situation, you still have to maintain that confidentiality in that situation. And in dual agency, I've said this before, must be disclosed in writing unless the agent is working under an oral agency agreement. So then there's this weird little twist. So make note of this. So let's say we have a buyer that has an oral agency agreement. Oral agency. And the seller didn't give permission up front for dual agency. Okay, so you have a seller who said no to dual agency, and then a buyer shows up that just has an oral agreement with their buyer agent, and they want to see the house. So the listing agent can go to the seller and say, will you allow this buyer agent to show the house? You said that you wouldn't do dual agency, but for this situation, would you allow that? And they can give oral permission. But if the buyer agency is already in writing, okay, and the seller, we have the same seller situation, you can't just get oral permission from the seller. It has to be in writing. So if the buyer agency is in writing, then the dual agency has to be in writing from the seller as well. Okay? That's why I do this up front when I list the house. And I tell them right up front, I say, I would not want to take a listing that the seller doesn't give me permission to act as a dual agent, because there are hundreds of Allen Tate agents in this area. And that would mean eliminating any buyers that they might bring to you. That would be foolish. So I would insist on them giving us permission to act as a dual agent. Otherwise, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. And me as well. So no oral consent by the buyer seller if the buyer agency is already in writing. It's got to be in writing. Everybody understand that little twist? Did I lose anybody? Now's the time. I'm just going to say this up front, that silence is not golden when it comes to real estate class. If you have questions, because, about half of you are not going to pass the final exam, just statistically. And the reason you're not going to pass the exam is maybe because you didn't ask the questions during the class. And so I just invite you, there is no shame in asking questions. If you don't want to ask it during class, come up to me at the break and say, I just didn't get that whole oral dual agency thing. Can you explain it to me again? I'm happy to do that. But there's just no reason not to ask those questions, because now's the time to do it. You're paying big bucks to be here. And so I want you to get every penny out of that. And it doesn't bother me in the least to answer those questions. Okay? So I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, I do have a question.
All right. It worked.
I know for a fact it's not on the exam.
Okay.
in the situation that you have that where initially a seller says they're not wanting to
Be a dual agent.
enter in dual agency.
Yep.
And a buyer comes along and they say, yes, it's okay to show this one time. They wanna make an offer. Is there, or even if there's they say no to dual agency and there's a buyer's agent that comes in, is there an actual form where it, gives the permission for dual agency, or is that just redoing a complete listing contract?
Well, more than likely, what you would do is the page that has dual agency in it, you would go back and just have them redo that page. You wouldn't need to redo all the pages of the
I
listing.
don't know how formal that would be.
Oh, what's
I
that?
didn't know how formal that would have to be, because, as far as an actual listing contract, you can't alter anything, wording or anything like that. It's
Right,
in the
that's why you
contract.
would just redo that page and have them check the box that says that they give permission, or initial next to the box that says, I give permission. And then, include that in your file, so you'd have that. I suppose you could have something drawn up by an attorney, but that wouldn't make sense, And as far as I know, there's no addendum created just to add that dual agency, so that's what I would do, is just have them redo that on the page.
So it's a simple procedure.
Yeah. So where people get in trouble sometimes is when somebody, they call on a house and you meet them at the house and they start acting like a buyer's agent, but they don't tell them that their, the listing firm is their firm. They're, obviously working for the company. They don't talk about dual agency. And so we have what we call undisclosed dual agency, where the person thinks that they're working exclusively for them, and maybe they're given information that they shouldn't give and things like that. So it's important that this disclosure happens as early as possible, so that we don't end up jeopardizing the interest of either party. And if it happens that after the fact it's found out that you were actually working for the other side too, it could mean that the contract gets dissolved, or you lose your commission, or any number of bad things could happen. So it's pretty important that this stuff is discussed up front. We talked about seller sub-agency before. Remember our discussion about seller sub-agency? So I want to make sure we kind of highlight this. So in buyer agency, the broker works exclusively for the buyer. In seller sub-agency, the broker represents the seller in the transaction. So seller sub-agency may be within that same firm, or it could be with a different firm. I told you that Allen Tate doesn't allow other firms to work for our sellers. So if you were working for RE/MAX and you wanted to show our house as a seller sub-agent, we would say no. Only buyer agents can work with, can bring us an offer, right? Now, I could work as a seller sub-agent within my firm, right? The buyer comes along, they say, I don't want to sign buyer agency with you. Fine, I'll work for the seller. Anything that you say can and will be used against you, just remember that. So we talked about two different kinds of seller sub-agency. One is my firm, every broker in the firm is working for the seller. We're all sub-agents of the seller. But if, in some companies, if they allow you to work, like for instance, if I have the buyer, but they don't want to sign agency with me, I could go to a different firm's listing and maybe work for the seller as a seller sub-agent. And that would be okay, so two different firms. All right, so designated dual agency. I started to talk about this before. This is when, of course, the firm chooses two different brokers in the firm to represent the buyer and one to represent the seller. This is still dual agency. One firm, one or two clients, one transaction, but in this case, we've designated one broker to work with the buyer and another to work with the seller. So the most important thing in designated dual agency, first of all, who designates? Who decides which agents are going to work with him? The BIC does. The BIC decides that. And of course, it's all part of the company policy, exactly how that's going to work. But most of the time, it's pretty obvious. So I have the listing, and you have the buyer. And we both work for the same company. The broker's going to say, you work with the buyer, and I work with the seller. It's pretty obvious, right? It's possible that I have the listing and some buyer comes along and says they want to buy it. And I don't want to get into a dual agency situation where I'm working with both the buyer and the seller. So the company could designate another broker to act as the buyer's agent, right? So they designate somebody else to work with it. The most important thing about this, though, is, what is your name? Demario. So the most important thing is if you're going to be designated to work with the buyer, you can't know anything about my seller. Because if you did, it would give an advantage to that buyer. Same thing is true for me. If I know something about that buyer before they designate him to work with that buyer, I have a built-in advantage for my seller. And so the broker has to determine, does either broker have information about the other party? And if they do, they cannot be designated. Does that make sense?
But what
Kim?
makes it become designated?
What's that?
What makes it become designated?
Well, there's not really a formal swearing-in service or anything. Essentially, most of the time, it is simply obvious. The broker that's working with the sellers continues to do so. The buyer's agent continues to work with them. But it's possible, like in the scenario I just mentioned, where you have a buyer that comes and wants to look at my house, but I don't want to work with both parties, that the broker says, well, I'm going to designate so-and-so to work with it. And so they'd meet with so-and-so and say, I got a buyer that wants to buy one of our listings, you're going to work with the buyer. So they give that out. And it might be that I collect a referral fee for that, right? I'm giving away a buyer, basically. But there isn't really any kind of formal service as far as that. But both parties have to give permission to not only act as for the firm to not only act as dual agents, but also designated agency. And so there's another little place where the buyers and the sellers on their agency agreement have to initial that says, I give permission for you to act as a designated agent. And so if they initial both the dual agency and the designated agency, then you've done what you needed to do.
So if I'm the dual agent for the buyer and the seller,
Okay, you're working with both of them.
right?
Can you have designated agency in that
Right.
case? No.
No.
It's
So
just
then they
flat
have
out
to
dual
assign
agency.
another agent or remove me, correct?
Right, you would be removed from being one party, from working with one party or the other. Um, Where it gets sticky is, what if I'm working, let's say I'm working with a seller, and I'm also working with a buyer. And I've worked with this buyer for months trying to find him a house, and all of a sudden, they look at one of my listings. Okay? Can the broker designate another broker to work with that buyer at this point? Why not?
You have a whole bunch of knowledge that you shouldn't have.
I have too much knowledge about that buyer. I've been hauling around in my car for months now. I know everything about them, right? So I know how much they're qualified for. I know their family situation. I know that they want to be in this particular area or school district or in a, one level house or whatever it is. I know too much. So we could designate another agent to work with them. We could have another agent working with them, but it would still be strictly dual agency, not designated agency, because we know too much. Which means it limits what we can say and what we can do. That becomes a really hard situation.
So if you're working with the buyer and the seller
Yeah.
and you close, you get paid double commission?
No.
How does that work?
People use that example all the time. If I'm working with a buyer and they buy another house, am I gonna get paid? Yes. If I'm working with a buyer and they buy a Remax house, I'm gonna get paid. If I'm working with a seller and they sell the house, I'm gonna get paid. So if it just so happens that the buyer and the seller are working on the same house, I'm gonna get paid from both sides, yes. But that's not doubling how much money I get, because I would have sold that buyer a house anyway, right? Because I'm working with that buyer to find him a house. So it's a kind of false equivalency to say I'm getting twice the commission.
So you would get the same exact percentage on the?
No, not necessarily. Oftentimes the listing agency just determines how much the buyer agency is gonna get, right? But it doesn't have to be the same. So I gave the example, I think last night, of selling some land, and the seller said, Wayne, you've done all this work on this land to try to get it sold. I think you should get more than the buyer's agent who's just gonna come and, they're gonna buy land. It's not like there's inspections and, too much to do. So we listed it for 8%, the land, and the listing side was 5%, and the buying side was 3%. So they're not always the same. But if I had the buyer for that, well, that should qualify. The firm would get 8%, and I would get some cut of that, right, depending on that situation. And by the way, the amount that the individual broker gets varies. In fact, I couldn't tell you what percentage of the commission I get, because it changes over time. The more houses I sell, the higher my percentage from out of take goes. And so, I might have a higher percentage for this sale, and because I sold this one, now the next one is even higher. And so that varies over time. It's like a sliding scale, like the last 12 months, it sort of moves along with time, and they're looking at the number of sales or the amount of sales over that time.
Do y'all have caps with Allen tape? Do y'all have caps with Allen tape?
No,
No cap.
we don't have a cap. And I'll talk more about this probably later, but the fact is, when I tell people, all of the companies have to keep the lights on, right? And so, when you're out shopping for where you're gonna go, once you get your license, just bear in mind that there are lots of different ways for them to pay for the lights. Maybe it's collecting a fee for you to have a desk. Or, one company, the first company I worked for, you had to pay for the copies that you made. So every copy you paid, whatever, a penny a copy or something like that. And if you got pencils and pens, you had to buy all that yourself. Allen Tate doesn't do that. So, but the commission splits and caps and all of those kinds of things, in the end, the company is gonna pay their bills. And you're gonna have to look at what you get for whatever the fees and splits and so forth get you. And I would recommend to you that you look even beyond that to what the environment is in that office and the people that you're gonna be around and the kinds of mentors you might be surrounded by as well. I'll get off my soapbox about that. So, in dual agent, we have one firm, one transaction, and two clients. The same fiduciary duties to both parties are owed in dual agency. Same fiduciary duties, which neutralizes your actions. Designated agents owe exclusive fiduciary duties to their client. So it's just like if you were working in two different firms, right? The buyer's agent has exclusive fiduciary duties to that person. They can do all the things that you would do if you were in a separate firm from the seller. And dual and designated agency must be authorized by the firm and both parties in writing. And so, before anything is written up, before any offers are made, you gotta make sure you've got all this in writing. And then the nice thing is that the agency agreements, both buyer and listing, have this written right into it. So all I have to do is just put a little initial there, and they've given you permission to act as a dual agency and also as a designated agent. And at that, I'm gonna stop and we'll take a little break. After the break, I'm gonna say this up front, after the break, I'm gonna pass the sign-in sheet around again, if you would initial that. I've also got a bunch of handouts that I'm gonna give to you, including your homework. I'll give that to you as we start up the next section, and also a copy of the exclusive right to sell that's actually in play now. That looks different than what you have in your